It ends without a shot fired between superpowers. No surrender on a battleship. No triumphant march down a conquered capital. It ends with a key turning in a door, a red flag. Lowered in winter, a president signing a document that dissolves the country he leads. The state that defeated Hitler, split the atom, and sent the first human into space falls apart like ice breaking, quietly at first, then all at once. For decades Americans grew up under the shadow of a rival whose missiles could end the world in 30 minutes. And then one December week in 1991, the enemy vanished. If victory felt unreal, the question that followed was harder. Why did Russia, more precisely the Soviet Union, lose the Cold War? Start with a simple truth. The Cold War was not a war that you win the way you win a battle. It was a contest of systems measured by endurance, who could marshal industry, science, and spirit over half a century without breaking. One side broke, not because it was weak, but because it could not pay for its future, could not reform its present, and could no longer persuade its people that the sacrifices made sense. To understand how that happened, we need to walk through the contradictions that built the Soviet rise and orchestrated its fall. First, names matter. When we say Russia, we're talking about the Russian core of a larger project, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was a federation of 15 republics with their own flags, languages, and histories. Moscow was the center, Russia the largest and most powerful part, but the Soviet experiment was imperial in scale and ambition. Its defeat was not a battlefield collapse. It was the slow failure of a model built for the 20th centuries. First half trying to survive its second. The Soviet Union began the Cold War with an advantage that the West sometimes underplayed, a mobilization state. It could pick priorities and flood them with resources, steel, electricity, engineers, labor, without waiting for markets or votes. In a world defined by heavy industry and big wars that focus one results. Dams rose, blast furnaces roared, weapons rolled off lines like bread. The first decades turned a peasant empire into an industrial power. Victory in World War II gave the system its moral core, whatever the price this state had. Saved the world from fascism. That memory insulated the regime for a generation. But the logic that built strength also seeded weakness. The command economy excelled at building more of what it already knew how to build. It struggled when the world pivoted from steel and coal to microchips and software, from mass to precision, from copying known designs to innovating new ones. Central planners could assign quotas to tons of pig iron. They could not as easily assign creativity or tell a factory manager how to make better. What they could do, they did: punish missed targets, reward compliant numbers, and pretend that numbers were truth. Over time, the numbers lied. By the 1970s, growth slowed. Stagnation became the quiet diagnosis no one in power said aloud. The symptoms were everywhere. Lines for basic goods, shops with empty shelves, a black market that filled in what the plan missed. Economists have names for it: soft budget, constraints, shortage economies, but citizens knew it as daily life. The best engineers went to the military sector because that was where resources were reliable. Consumer goods lagged. A washing machine could be a triumph. A decent pair of shoes, a quest. The joke told itself. The state pretended to pay us and we pretended to work. The military-industrial complex, Vojenno-Promyshlenny complex, became the most efficient part of the system. It had to be. The arms race with the United States demanded excellence. In missiles, submarines, radars, and aircraft, the Soviet Union matched and sometimes surpassed Western hardware in certain categories, tanks by the tens of thousands, an air defense network that worried every Western pilot, the largest ballistic missile payloads on the planet. But even here, the model extracted a price. Talent, materials, and attention flowed to defense at the expense of the civilian economy. You can build 1,000 tanks. You never fire. You cannot live in them. The thing that kept it all afloat for a time was oil. In the 1970s, prices spiked. petrodollars, flowed into Soviet coffers, masking inefficiencies and paying for grain and technology. Imports that a closed, non-convertible ruble could not. The state balanced accounts with nature's help. Then, in 1986, the price collapsed. Revenue shrank. Debts accumulated. Eastern European allies, deep in hock to Western banks, needed support or threatened to default. Hard currency, the dollars and marks that bought crucial imports, grew scarce. The bill for the 1970s came due in the 1980s, and the state discovered that it had built a household budget dependent on whether it did not control. There was another bill the system couldn't avoid: empire. Holding Eastern Europe required money, troops, and political commitment. Comecon, the Soviet-led economic bloc, ran on. Subsidized energy and enforced trade that made political sense and economic nonsense. Poland owed billions. East Germany needed loans. Hungary borrowed. Romania broke itself trying to pay. The occupation didn't look like a parade anymore. It looked like an invoice the center resented and could not cancel without admitting weakness. Ideology was supposed to justify the sacrifice. For a time it did. The promise of a classless society, of guaranteed work and education, of a future that made struggle meaningful, those were not trivial. The country that banned the more open critics still educated them. The space program, the Academy of Sciences, a literacy rate that Tsars never achieved. These were achievements people could point to and be proud of. But ideology is brittle when it has to explain too much that everyone sees and no one can say. By the mid-Brezhnev years, the gap between official story and lived reality grew into a canyon. Censorship enforced silence. Samizdat, the underground circulation of banned texts, spread. The Helsinki Final Act of 1975, which recognized borders and human rights, gave dissidents a legal vocabulary. Andrei Sakharov, a father of the hydrogen bomb, became a conscience. Alexander Solzhenitsyn dragged the Gulag into daylight. Humor turned crueler because it was safer than anger. A society cannot survive on cynicism forever. It can survive on it long enough to rot. And then there was Afghanistan. In 1979, the Politburo decided to send troops to stabilize a friendly government in Kabul. It expected discipline to restore stability, as it had in Budapest and Prague. Instead, it found a mountain war against an enemy funded and trained by Pakistan, the United States, and others. The Red Army adapted, fought hard, and learned painful lessons. Metal came home in zinc coffins. Mothers asked why. The war lasted a decade. It did what long wars do to empires: spent blood alongside treasure, and eroded the belief in inevitability that a system needs to function. All the while, the United States kept its footing. Not perfectly, not without contradictions, but it kept an economy that generated new things faster than the Kremlin could plan to steal them. Containment built alliances. NATO held, despite arguments. Cultural gravity did work. No covert operation could match. Blue jeans, rock music on X-ray vinyl, movies, a picture of how life might feel if what you made you got to keep, and if you wanted more, you could try. When President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, the power of the words wasn't rhetorical, it was structural. A rival who can double defense spending and still deliver a new refrigerator isn't just a military problem. He's a pacing threat. American policy wasn't a straight line. There were detours and disasters, Vietnam the most obvious, and plenty of covert acts that mocked the ideals the U.S. claimed to stand for. But in the 1980s, the pressure sharpened. Export controls starved Soviet industry of critical technologies. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment tied trade to emigration rights, forcing choices. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America broadcast culture and news. When the United States announced a strategic defense initiative, missile defense in the sky, the debate among scholars is whether it was achievable. What mattered then wasn't feasibility. It was psychology. If the Pentagon spends and the CIA innovates, do we try to match them? Or do we reform? A system built on not losing face had to try both. Failed at both. There's a more complicated piece to this: China. The Sino Soviet split in the 1960s left Moscow with a hostile communist neighbor on a vast border. The rivalry drained attention and troops and undercut the Soviets' claim to ideological leadership. When America opened to Beijing, it moved another chess piece. A two-front Cold War, one literal, was a pressure the Soviet Union could not escape. Against this landscape walks a man who tried to rescue his country by changing it. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985 at 54, young for the job, articulate, convinced. The country needed oxygen. Perestroika, restructuring, aimed to free the economy from suffocation. Give managers room, introduce limited markets, allow cooperatives. Glasnost, openness, aimed to free the conversation. Less censorship, more public debate, admission of past crimes. New thinking in foreign policy aimed to end the most dangerous part of the Cold War. Withdraw from Afghanistan, negotiate arms control, pull back from Eastern Europe. The reforms were moral and necessary. They were also destabilizing. Openness revealed truths the system had survived by hiding. The great famines were named. The terror counted. The stories of ruined lives told out loud. Chernobyl erupted in 1986 and exposed not just technical flaws but the lethal cost of secrecy. The economy, half-planned and half-market, did not transition elegantly. Prices were distorted. Supply chains built for quotas failed under freedom. New cooperatives blurred into criminal networks. Shortages grew worse before anything improved. The social contract, fear traded for predictability, broke at both ends. Less fear, less predictability. Gorbachev's greatest foreign policy decision may have been his hardest political one. He refused to use tanks to hold Eastern Europe. The Brezhnev doctrine died not with a speech, but with restraint. In 1989, dominoes fell, free elections in Poland, crowds in Leipzig and Prague. The Berlin Wall came apart under hands and hammers. The Soviet army stayed in barracks. For this, Gorbachev won the Nobel Peace Prize. He also lost leverage that had helped hold his own union together. There is no external empire without internal costs. When you let go abroad, the logic comes home. Nationalities rose. In the Baltics, singing revolutions reclaimed sovereignty. In the Caucasus, disputes, Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, ignited. In Central Asia, ethnic clashes broke out. Russian anger met non-Russian anger in a feed loop that rewrote maps in people's heads before it did on paper. The Russian Republic, under Boris Yeltsin, declared its laws supreme over Soviet law. The center shrank. By 1991, a reform meant to save the Union, a new treaty to loosen it into a true federation, was on the table. Hardliners in the party, military, and KGB tried to stop it with a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow. State television announced emergency rule. The president was isolated. Boris Yeltsin climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament and called the coup what it was. Crowds came. The army hesitated. The coup collapsed in 3 days. The act meant to preserve the system accelerated its end. In December, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavisa Accords, declaring the USSR dissolved. Gorbachev resigned. The red flag came down. The Cold War was over. Did America win it? In the sense that its model outlasted its rival, yes. But it's too easy to claim victory without understanding why the other side fell. The Soviet Union was a country built to win an industrial century, mass, scale, discipline, sacrifice, and it did. It then tried to compete in an information century, flexibility, innovation, consumer satisfaction, without changing the architecture. It clung to empire when empire became expensive and reform. When reform became risky, tried to do both and lost both. It overinvested in guns when its people wanted butter, then tried to buy butter abroad with oil rent, and then discovered that Oil markets don't take ideology as payment. There are objections worth hearing. The Soviet Union did not lose because Russians were lazy or because socialism cannot feed people. It lost because a particular system, centralized, punitive, insulated from feedback, could not adapt faster than the world demanded. It lost because it treated dissent as treason and turned information into a threat. It lost because it built a political economy that rewarded lying upward and punished truth-telling downward. It lost because too many intelligent people were diverted into ministries managing scarcity and inventions the world didn't want. It lost because it tried to hold together a multi-ethnic empire with a language of equality and a practice of hierarchy. Lost because, in the end, its elites stopped believing, and its citizens stopped pretending. Two final arguments circle this history and deserve care. First, the Reagan question. Did U.S. defense buildup and SDI break the Soviet economy? They mattered. They forced choices at the worst moment, sharpened contradictions, and signaled that the U.S. could outspend the USSR without breaking. But American pressure worked because it landed on a brittle surface. You don't collapse a healthy system with a speech. You hasten a collapse that is already built into the geometry. Second, the stab-in-the-back myth that surfaces now and then in Russian politics. That the USSR was betrayed internally rather than defeated by competition. The truth is less dramatic and more instructive. The Soviet Union wasn't stabbed. It starved itself of what all systems need: legitimacy. When a state can no longer command belief at home, it cannot command history abroad. The West did not march into Moscow. The Russians, Ukrainians, Balts, Georgians, Uzbeks, and others walked out of a house that no longer sheltered them. For Americans, the lesson is not that history rewarded virtue automatically. It didn't. Rewarded persistence, adaptability, and a willingness under pressure to reform what needed reforming. The United States survived Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, oil shocks, and still managed to innovate its way into an economy the world wanted to plug into. It did so imperfectly, with costs the 1990s exported and the 2000s inherited. But it did so in a way that a closed system could not mimic and a frightened system would not risk. For Russians, the lesson is harder and more intimate. The country that sacrificed the most to defeat fascism inherited a peace that demanded different skills: persuasion over compulsion, flexibility over decree, a tolerance for imperfection over the security of control. When it tried them briefly, it glimpsed another future. When it recoiled, it chose a past that could not return. So why did Russia lose the Cold War? Because the Soviet Union ran out of the two things a great power needs most: time and trust. Time to reform before the bill came due. Trust from citizens that the future promised was a future delivered. In geopolitics, money and missiles matter. But without those two, they matter less than you think. Picture, finally, the end from both sides of the ocean. In Moscow, a man switches off the light. In an office that always stayed on, closes a safe that no longer contains a country, and walks into a corridor where the portraits will be taken down next week. In the American Midwest, a siren system rusts in a field, its weekly test finally canceled. Between those two rooms lies the story of a contest that defined a century, and the quiet way it ended. The warning embedded in that quiet is simple. No state loses to an enemy it can see as decisively as it loses to the future it refuses to meet.